The tariffs that President Trump had planned to impose on Mexico and Canada have been pushed out by a month. How does the company plan to take advantage of this 4-week delay?
I think longer term is the bigger concern. These kind of tariffs, especially in these two countries, are very significant. And if they persist beyond months, we could see billions and billions of dollars of pressure on the industry, lost jobs, lots of impacts to communities and our ecosystem in the industry. And that's what we're talking to the administration about and congressional leaders.
For decades, the United States, Mexico, and Canada have built one of the most efficient automotive production networks in the world. Mexico became the United States car factory, establishing itself as a key pillar in the global industry. But now, everything is about to change with the arrival of the new occupant of the White House and his aggressive trade policy. A tariff war has erupted, and this isn't just an economic adjustment. It could be the start of one of the most severe crises in the history of the automotive sector, if within the time frame agreed upon by these three countries, the goals Trump is pursuing aren't met. But what does this mean for the prices of new and used cars? How will it affect workers, factories, and even consumers in Latin America? Before diving into the problem, let's look at the 3 key reasons why Trump is making this decision. First, he wants to close the U.S. trade deficit. This means the country imports more than it exports, creating a negative balance in international trade. For Trump and his team, this deficit represents a loss of money and a threat to national industry because, in their view, the U.S. relies too heavily on products manufactured abroad instead of bolstering its own production. The second reason is even more aggressive. Trump wants to force companies manufacturing in Mexico and Canada to bring their production back to the United States. His goal is to strengthen the country's industrial base, boost local manufacturing, and create more jobs in sectors like automotive, steel, and technology. In his logic, if he artificially raises the cost of imported goods through tariffs, it'll be more profitable for companies to assemble within the U.S. than to rely on foreign factories. The third reason is geopolitical. I won't dive too deep here because this is a car channel. But we've seen that Trump wants to pressure different blocs to distance themselves from China, using a tool that even China can't afford to lose. After all, we're talking about the world's most important market. The big problem is that Mexico and Canada have been key partners in the auto trade, with factories assembling models sold in the US. If these companies are forced to relocate production, it won't be quick or cheap, and the cost could end up falling on consumers. So the question is, can this actually work, or will it just make cars more expensive and hurt everyone? The issue is that this adjustment won't be fast or easy. And along the way, it could cost thousands of jobs in all 3 countries involved. To understand it better, let's think about how tariffs directly impact the automotive industry. When the U.S. imposes higher taxes on imported cars, manufacturers have 2 options: absorb the cost, which would cut into their profit margins, or pass it on to consumers, making new cars more expensive. But it doesn't stop there. Tariffs also hit auto parts, meaning not only will new cars cost more, but repairs and maintenance for used ones will too. From basic components like brakes and filters to electronics and transmissions, everything could go up in price. On top of that, Mexico and Canada won't sit idly by. They'd respond with equally tough tariffs on US products. This would create a ripple effect. Not only would cars in the US get pricier, but so would those made in Mexico and Canada, since many auto parts come from the US. The result? Higher production costs that will inevitably show up in the final price of cars at dealerships in these countries. Now, while the blow to Mexico and Canada might not hit their trade balances as hard as it would the US, let's not forget something crucial. Many cars assembled in Mexico are also exported to Latin America, and that's where another problem arises. Consumers in countries like Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and Peru have less purchasing power than those in the US, so a price hike could seriously limit access to certain models. This could not only reduce sales in the region, but also push people toward cheaper or used cars, affecting the new car market. So what starts as a strategy to strengthen the US industry could end up hurting millions of consumers, both inside and outside the United States. It's estimated that car prices in the US could rise by up to 25%, but the impact could be even bigger. Why? Because the North American automotive production chain isn't linear. It's a highly integrated system where components cross borders multiple times between Mexico, the US, and Canada before a car is finished. An engine might be made in one country, assembled in another, and then sent back for final installation. With every border crossing, a new tariff would apply, driving up the total cost of the vehicle even more. Many believe prices might drop in the medium term, But the reality is quite different. Even if brands decide to leave Mexico and move factories to the US, cars won't get cheaper. On the contrary, they'd be just as expensive or even more so. And there are two key reasons for this. Automotive inflation, relocating factories, would create a temporary shortage in car supply, driving prices up. Plus, labor costs in the US are much higher than in Mexico, making it more expensive to produce a car domestically from the start. Investment costs. Brands can't just pick up a factory and move it to another country. Building new assembly plants in the US requires multi-billion-dollar investments in infrastructure, technology, and training. Those costs will be reflected in the final price of cars, and it's unlikely brands will absorb that loss themselves. Now, some brands might try to cushion the tariff impact to stay competitive, but that could jeopardize their financial stability. Despite the automotive industry's massive revenue, its profit margins are razor thin. A sudden cost spike could shrink profits to almost nothing, or even force some brands to cut jobs, scale back production, or discontinue less profitable models. At the end of the day, this trade war doesn't just affect consumers, it also hits brands and workers in the automotive sector. And the big question remains, is the cost of this strategy really worth it? From Mexico and Latin America's perspective, some might think the price impact won't be as bad since tariffs mostly target the US. But there are other key factors that could drastically shift the landscape. First, brands have made huge investments in Mexican factories, planned around units sold in the US. If they suddenly lose that market, they'll need to offset the revenue drop, which could mean pricier cars in Mexico and other regional countries. There's another option. Brands could close plants in Mexico and start importing cars assembled in the US. The problem? Those cars would face a 25% tariff, causing prices for many models to skyrocket. But here's something even more worrying. What if the US extends its protectionist policy? If the US government keeps slapping aggressive tariffs on imports from other countries in the region, those nations might adopt similar policies in retaliation. This would shrink the supply of vehicles and make the new car market in the region even more expensive and restrictive. And what about cars made in the US? Many assume US-made cars will dodge these price hikes, but that's far from the truth. In fact, saying a car is fully made in the USA is, in most cases, inaccurate. Brands typically do one of two things to earn that label: import half-finished cars from other countries and complete assembly in the US, or import most components from abroad and assemble them stateside. Where do most of those parts come from? You guessed it, China, Mexico, and Canada. Engines, transmissions, electrical systems, infotainment modules, even structural components. Virtually every made-in-USA car relies on an international supply chain. With new tariffs, the cost of these parts will shoot up, making US-assembled cars significantly more expensive too. Preliminary studies suggest the average car price in the US could jump by at least $3,000, a direct blow to working and middle-class families. For many already struggling to afford a new car, this could make it simply unattainable. More consumers might turn to used cars, overheating the secondhand market and driving those prices up too. In short, neither imported cars, US-assembled cars, nor used cars will escape this trade war's impact. That's where the used car market comes in. With new car prices rising, more people will turn to the secondhand market, spiking demand. And when there are more buyers than cars available, prices inevitably climb. We saw this during the pandemic. You might think, well, at least used cars have cheaper parts, so it won't be that bad. Think again, parts won't be spared either. As we've seen, many auto components come from Mexico, Canada, and China. And if the US hikes import tariffs, the cost of essentials like brakes, suspensions, sensors, and transmissions will rise sharply. But it doesn't end there. Higher car prices will also drive up maintenance and insurance costs. Insurance premiums largely depend on a car's market value. So if new and used cars get pricier, policies will too, making it costlier to protect a vehicle. And don't get me started on interest rates. If prices keep climbing and inflation spikes, banks and lenders will raise rates on car loans, making financing a new or used car even more expensive in the medium term. With this decision, Trump and his team could deal a brutal blow to the traditional automotive industry, handing it on a silver platter to Chinese manufacturers eager to expand and sell in any market they can. And here's where it gets interesting. This won't just hit Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. It'll also affect foreign brands producing in Mexico and relying on the US market. We're talking giants like Mazda, Honda, Toyota, Kia, Hyundai, Mercedes-Benz, BMW, Volkswagen, Audi, and Nissan, all with plants in Mexico now facing a crisis from rising costs and trade uncertainty. But while traditional brands are caught in this storm, Chinese manufacturers see a golden opportunity with increasingly competitive prices, advances in electric and hybrid tech, and massive backing from the Chinese government. Brands like BYD, Chery, Jack, MG, and Great Wall could fill the gap left by established players and gain ground in Latin America, where US brands are already minor players. In other words, the US wants to protect its auto industry, but might end up pushing it off a cliff. Let's hope things don't escalate. But what do you think? Is this a smart move? Is Trump playing with fire? Are American manufacturers on the decline? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. To each and every one of you, thanks for watching, and see you next time.